In the past 6 episodes of this video series, The History of the Muslims of Sri Lanka, we have explained how, over many centuries, Arabic-speaking sailors and traders, mostly from the Middle East, had regularly been visiting Sri Lanka. They came here for the collection and purchase of a variety of indigenous goods and produce of the island, which they shipped for sale to populations in other countries. We also learned how over the centuries, a number of these Arabs had settled down in Sri Lanka, falling in line with the invitations and service of the kings and other inhabitants of this island. With the advent of Islam in Arabia in the 7th century, these Arab sailors, as well as the Arabs who had settled down in this island, converted to this new religion of Islam and were thereafter known as Muslims. Now, in this 7th episode of The History of the Muslims of Sri Lanka, we are going to describe an interesting historical incident that involved 2 orphan Muslim girls from Sri Lanka, but on further examination we would realize that it actually involves and brings together all the connections that identify and characterize these 8th century Arab Muslims of Sri Lanka. Let me first list out these connections of the 8th century Muslims of Sri Lanka, and thereafter give a brief description of the backdrop to these connections, leading to the incident involving the 2 orphan Sri Lankan Muslim girls. In this manner, we could begin to appreciate how an apparently minor incident involving these 2 orphan Muslim girls would trigger off a series of events that would eventually culminate with Sindh being annexed to the Islamic Empire. These are empire-changing events. So then, what are these connections of the 8th century Muslims of Sri Lanka? Connection number 1. The kings and people of Sri Lanka. In the 8th century, the Muslims of Sri Lanka were Arabic-speaking and had established good relations with the kings of Sri Lanka. These kings gave license and involved these seafaring Arabic-speaking Muslims to export indigenous Sri Lankan goods and agricultural produce from the island to other countries, as well as to establish friendly diplomatic channels with kings and royalty of other countries. Connection number 2. The many complex but integrated networks in the Indian and Arabian seas. Of sailors, merchants, boats, seaports, collection centers at all these seaports, and distributors of goods at all destination seaports. This map demonstrates best the vast number of trading seaports on the coastlines of the lands surrounding the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea. We can just imagine the number of ships and boats that were involved in collecting and exchanging goods from each of these ports and then transporting them across the seas on well-traversed sea routes. We can also well imagine the number of sailors and traders who were actively involved in this collection and sea transportation industry. This is the second massive connection the 8th century Muslims of Sri Lanka had established and strengthened over the centuries. Connection number 3. The fast-growing Muslim empire, which ensured a massively increasing market for goods and produce from Sri Lanka. How this empire was growing needs a little explaining. Let me describe how Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in a small way introduced Islam, and how over a relatively short period of time, its adherents, the Muslims, built such a vast empire. In 570 AD, Prophet Muhammad was born in Mecca. 40 years later, in 610 AD, he began to receive revelations of the Quran. In 622 AD, the hijra or migration and the establishment of an Islamic administration in Medina was set up. 10 years later, in 632 AD, the Holy Prophet died. At the time of the death of the Holy Prophet in 632 AD, the following areas of the Arabian Peninsula were under Muslim rule. The Caliph Abu Bakr reigned for 2 years from 632 to 634 AD. The following areas, marked in light blue, came under Muslim rule. The second Caliph Umar reigned for 10 years from 634 to 644 AD. The following areas marked in purple were added to the growing Muslim kingdom. By 661 AD, the Umayyad Empire was established. The following areas were added to the Muslim kingdom by 661 AD. The last graphic shows the extent of the Muslim Empire in 661 AD. The growing of the Arab Empire brought in more wealth to Sri Lanka and obviously pleased the kings of Sri Lanka because it meant that the Muslim traders were finding foreign markets for Sri Lankan goods increasing with the growth of the Islamic Empire. It was probably around 710 AD that the incident of the 2 orphan Muslim girls from Sri Lanka took place. The incident that triggered the annexation of Sindh to the fast-growing Muslim Empire. Historian Al-Baladhuri, the author of Early Muslim Conquests, says that prior to the conquest of Sindh, which is India, by Arab Lieutenant Muhammad bin Qasim in 715 AD, the king of the island of Rubies, in order to ingratiate himself with Hajjaj, the viceroy of Iraq, sent him some women who were born in his country as Muslims, their fathers who had been merchants having died, but their ships were attacked by the Maid people of Daibul, near modern-day Karachi, in barges. The king of the island of Rubies, as Sri Lanka was sometimes known, in order to win the favor of Hajjaj bin Yusuf, the powerful viceroy of Iraq, repatriated some orphaned girls who were born in Sri Lanka. Their fathers, who were Muslim merchants, had died. The ships conveying the girls were attacked by pirates near modern Karachi, and this incident resulted in the annexation of Sindh to the Arab Empire. Although the name of the king of the island of Rubies has not been mentioned, the inescapable conclusion leads us to believe that the sovereign referred to above was none other than the illustrious Manavamma, who ruled Anuradhapura from 648 to 719 AD. We learn that their ship was attacked near modern Karachi. The pirates rowed out in canoes and captured the ship, and these Sri Lankan Muslim girls were abducted. A desperate plea for aid by one of the Muslim women from the island of Rubies eventually reached the notice of Hajjaj, who sent 2 generals, one after the other, to answer this entreaty, but both perished without accomplishing their task. A personal request by letter from Hajjaj himself to the Sindh ruler Raja Dahir met with the non-committal answer that they were captured by pirates whom I do not control. This hard-hearted response and the plight of the Muslim maidens was made into the casus belli, or the reason for declaring war against Sindh. And this is how an incident in the middle of the ocean that involved the abduction of two Sri Lankan Muslim girls brought about massive changes to the empires of the world.